There are three kinds of men in the world. The kind who cry easily at movies, at songs, at the ordinary accumulation of small disappointments that constitute most human lives. The kind who never cry at all, who have built a wall between themselves and that particular form of release so solid and so old that they have forgotten it was ever built, forgotten there was ever anything on the other side of it. And then the third kind, the kind who carry everything without visible weight for so long, with such complete discipline, that when the wall finally cracks, when the thing they have been carrying for years or decades finally exceeds the capacity of even their extraordinary containment, the effect is unlike anything the people around them have ever witnessed. Bumpy Johnson was the third kind. The day it happened was a Thursday in November 1952. Outside, Harlem was doing what Harlem did in November, moving fast against the cold. Collars up, breath visible, the particular urgency of a neighborhood that never really stopped moving but moved differently when the temperature dropped. Inside the small apartment on 118th Street, 3 people were present. A doctor named Calvin Reed, who had been treating Harlem's poor for 30 years and who charged what people could afford, which was often nothing. A woman named Dorothy, who had worked in Bumpy Johnson's organization for 11 years and who understood, better than almost anyone, the specific language of his silences. And Bumpy Johnson himself, sitting in a chair beside a hospital bed that had been brought into the apartment 3 weeks earlier, when it became clear that the person lying in it would not be going back to Harlem Hospital. Margaret Johnson, Bumpy's mother, died at 11:43 in the morning on a Thursday in November 1952. She was in her early 70s, which was a long life for a black woman who had spent most of it cleaning other people's houses and raising a son who would become one of the most significant figures in the history of American organized crime. She had been sick for 4 months. She had not, in those 4 months, ever mentioned being sick to anyone except Dr. Reed and Dorothy, who had been her primary caregiver. She had simply, one day, stopped being available for the weekly dinners she had shared with her son for 20 years. And when Bumpy had appeared at her door to find out why, he had found Dr. Reed there already, and he had understood, from the expression on the doctor's face, everything he needed to understand about what was happening. He had arranged everything: the hospital bed, the nursing care, the medications, the small army of invisible support that surrounded Margaret Johnson in her final months without her knowing, in any explicit way, that it was there because she would have objected, because she had spent her entire life refusing to be a burden and had no intention of starting now. He had arranged it with the same quiet, complete efficiency he brought to everything, the efficiency that left no trace, that looked, from the outside, like nothing in particular had been arranged at all. He had, also, in those 4 months, spent every Thursday evening at her apartment, not talking much, because Margaret hadn't had the energy for much talking toward the end. Just sitting, sometimes reading to her from the newspapers she had always loved, sometimes playing the jazz records she had kept since the 1930s, the ones with the covers worn soft from years of handling, sometimes just being there in the particular way that people can be present for each other without anything being said or done, the way that presence itself becomes the thing. The morning she died, he had been there since 6. He had known, from something in the quality of her breathing, from something in the way the room felt when he arrived, that this was the day. He had sat with her for 5 hours and 43 minutes. He had held her hand for the last 2 of those hours, which was more physical tenderness than most of the people who had ever known Bumpy Johnson had witnessed from him in their entire relationships with him. When it happened, when the breathing that had been the background sound of those 5 hours simply stopped, The room held that fact for a long time before anyone moved or spoke. Dr. Reed did what doctors do. He verified. He noted the time. He began the quiet, practical work of what comes after. Dorothy stood near the window, her hand over her mouth, her eyes closed. Bumpy Johnson sat in his chair beside the empty hospital bed for a very long time. Long enough that Dr. Reed, who had seen grief in every form over 3 decades of practicing medicine in Harlem, began, quietly and carefully, to pay attention. And then Bumpy Johnson put his face in his hands and wept. Not the contained, dignified weeping of a man who has given himself permission to feel something for a few minutes before reassembling. Not the brief, technical releasing of pressure that some men allow themselves at funerals as a form of social compliance. He wept the way people weep when they have not wept for a very long time. When the particular combination of circumstances and loss and accumulated weight finally overwhelms a system that has been operating at its absolute limit for years. He wept with his entire body, with a completeness that made both Dr. Reed and Dorothy look away, not from discomfort, but from the instinct that this was something private even in their presence, that whatever was happening in that chair was not meant to be witnessed, that the most respectful thing they could offer was the privacy of averted eyes. He wept for a long time. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The jazz record that had been playing when Margaret died continued to play, had cycled back to the beginning by the time Bumpy finally lifted his face from his hands. Outside, Harlem continued its November morning entirely unaware that anything of consequence was occurring in a small apartment on 118th Street. When Bumpy finally raised his face, it was not the face that Harlem knew. It was not the face that had sat across tables from mob bosses and federal investigators and corrupt politicians with the same unreadable calm. It was not the face that had looked at situations designed to provoke and found in them only the raw material for strategic response. It was the face of a man who had just lost the only person who had ever known all of him. The person who had known him before he became what he became, who had held the original version of him. The boy in Charleston with the clenched fists and the terrifying intelligence and the hunger for a world that treated him as what he was. She was the only one who ever called me Ellsworth, he said. His voice was not steady. Everyone else, from the time I was maybe 17, everyone else called me Bumpy. She never did, not once, not even when she was angry. She always called me Ellsworth. He was quiet for a moment. She said that was who I was, that Bumpy was just a name other people gave me, that Ellsworth was who she made. Nobody said anything because nothing adequate could be said. To understand what Margaret Johnson meant to Bumpy Johnson, you have to understand something about the architecture of his life that most people who studied him consistently missed. The error was in treating his power as the defining fact of his existence, in treating the empire, the territory, the operations, the network of connections that stretched from Harlem to Washington to places most people would never think to look, as the thing that explained him. In treating the legend as the whole story, the legend was not the whole story. The legend was the surface of a much deeper structure, and the foundation of that deeper structure was a woman who had stood outside a small apartment in Charleston with her son's hand in hers, and who had carried weight her entire life without showing it, and who had taught him, through the specific example of her own existence, what it meant to absorb the worst the world could do without losing the most essential thing about yourself. Margaret Johnson had not taught her son how to be powerful. She had taught him something harder and more important than that. She had taught him how to be consistent, how to be the same person in every room, whether that room was the back room at Ralph's restaurant with 10 of Vincent Torino's soldiers watching, or a quiet apartment in Harlem where a sick woman needed someone to sit beside her. She had taught him that who you were when nothing was at stake was more revealing than who you were when everything was, and that the measure of a man was not the moments of maximum pressure, but the ordinary Thursdays, the evenings spent reading newspapers to someone who loved you, the record playing while the breathing changed and the room held everything it needed to hold. What the city did not know was that the weeks surrounding Margaret Johnson's death were also the most dangerous weeks Bumpy had faced in years. 3 men had decided, independently and then together, that the winter of 1952 was the moment to move against him. They had watched him for years, catalogued his patterns, mapped his relationships, identified the infrastructure of everything he had built. They had been patient, waiting for the right vulnerability. The right moment, in their calculation, was a man whose attention was divided, whose usual focus had been fractured by his mother's dying, whose Thursday evenings were now spent in a small apartment on 118th Street. Their names were Curtis Webb, who ran a competing numbers operation, Thomas Pryor, who controlled the drug trade Bumpy had always kept out of Harlem, and a man known only as the Deacon, a connector who had decided that a reorganization of Harlem's power structure was, at this moment, both possible and profitable. They were wrong about one fundamental thing. The attention was not divided. It was differently deployed. Bumpy had known about all 3 of them since the 2nd week of October. He had known about their meetings, their arrangements, their assessments of his vulnerability. He had read the reports in that small apartment on 118th Street with the same focused attention he would have given them in his office, and he had made his decisions about each piece of it with the same cold clarity, and he had instructed Dorothy and his lieutenants on exactly what should happen and when, and he had returned his attention to the jazz record and the woman in the hospital bed. He had handled it without being present for any of the handling, which was itself a demonstration of the depth of what he had built. A structure so resilient it could absorb his partial absence and continue functioning at full capacity. Margaret Johnson died on a Thursday morning. By the following Tuesday, Curtis Webb had received a visit explaining the precise nature of the information gathered about his operations and the federal investigators who would receive it if his expansion south continued. Webb understood. He cancelled 3 planned operations and redirected northward. Thomas Pryor discovered that the arrangement he had believed he'd made with 2 of Bumpy's lieutenants had, in fact, been conducted, with 2 men who had been reporting every conversation to Dorothy for 6 weeks. Every approach, every dollar offered, every vulnerability identified, was on paper in a form deeply inconvenient for him. He sat across from one of Bumpy's senior people for 40 minutes, during which the terms of his continued operation in New York were renegotiated, significantly in Bumpy's favor. The Deacon was handled most cleanly of all. Bumpy did nothing directly. He simply let it be known, through Dorothy, to the network of people who constituted the Deacon's world, that he was aware the meetings had occurred. Not what was discussed, just that he knew. The Deacon's value was his reputation for operating below the awareness of the powerful. Once punctured, that reputation eroded. 3 clients quietly diversified. 2 others reached out directly to Bumpy's network. Within 6 weeks, the Deacon operated in a significantly reduced landscape. He had been diminished by awareness rather than by force, which was, as he later acknowledged, the cleanest thing he had ever seen done to someone in 30 years. All of this happened while Bumpy Johnson sat in a small apartment and held his mother's hand. Dorothy told him about the outcomes over several conversations in the weeks following Margaret's death. He listened with the same attention he had always given her. He asked the right questions. He gave the necessary instructions. At the end of the last conversation, before Dorothy left, he was quiet for a moment. "Did anyone contact my mother?" he asked. "During those months, did anyone approach her or watch her apartment?" Dorothy said no. Absolute certainty. He nodded, said nothing else. But Dorothy understood what the question meant. She understood that among all the intelligence he had received, the only piece that would have changed the nature of his response into something entirely different was whether anyone had been foolish enough to reach toward the apartment on 118th Street. Whether anyone had been cruel enough to use his mother as a piece on the board. Nobody had. And so the response had been what it had been. Clean, structural, definitive, but not brutal in the weeks following. Margaret's death, something shifted in Harlem. Not dramatically. The kind of shift that happens when a community understands, without being told, that something of weight has occurred. People who had known Bumpy for years remarked that he seemed the same, which was both exactly right and exactly wrong. The composure was there, the strategic clarity, the absolute refusal to be rattled. But underneath, they sensed something more fully present than before, as though the loss had not diminished him but completed him, as though he was now more entirely himself. Dorothy described it years later. She said, after his mother died, he stopped trying to be anything other than what he was. He'd always been close to that, but close isn't the same as there. After November 1952, he was there, fully. He didn't perform anymore, not even the small performances that everyone does. He just was exactly what he was, in every room, with every person, all the time. It was the most powerful thing I ever saw a person do. There is a specific story that illustrates this. About 6 weeks after Margaret died, a young man named Robert, 19 years old, who had been running numbers for less than a year, made a mistake. Not catastrophic, but real. A mistake born of fear and bad judgment that had cost the organization a meaningful amount and briefly created a vulnerability. The man who delivered this information expected a specific response. Everyone who knew Bumpy understood how he handled mistakes. There was a formula, precise consequence, cold, clear logic. What happened instead was this. Bumpy asked Robert to come see him. Robert arrived expecting the formula. He sat across from Bumpy, preparing himself for whatever was coming with the specific preparation of a 19-year-old, trying very hard not to look afraid. Bumpy looked at him for a long moment. Then he asked Robert about his family, where he was from, whether his mother was still in the city. The questions were gentle, genuinely curious, the questions of a man who actually wanted to know the answers. Robert, confused, answered. He was from the Bronx. His mother had moved to Philadelphia after his father died, to be near her sister. He sent money when he could. It was part of why he'd taken the numbers job. Bumpy listened to all of it. Then he was quiet. "My mother died 6 weeks ago," he said. Robert said he was sorry. He meant it. "She taught me something about mistakes," Bumpy said. "She made plenty herself. She said the thing about a mistake is it tells you something true about yourself. Either something you already knew and had been avoiding, or something you didn't know and needed to learn. She said the question to ask isn't what punishment does this deserve, but what does this tell me about what I need to understand better?" He looked at Robert directly. "So I'm asking you that question, not for me, for you. What does this mistake tell you that you need to understand better?" Robert thought about it. He answered honestly. He said he had acted out of fear, that a situation had developed faster than he knew how to handle, and he had made the wrong decision because it resolved the immediate pressure at the cost of longer-term stability. He said he hadn't had enough experience to hold both things at once. Bumpy nodded slowly. That's an honest answer. My mother would have liked you. He gave Robert a different assignment, one that would teach him exactly the skill he had identified as missing. He docked the amount from Robert's earnings over a period long enough to be real, but not long enough to create resentment. He never mentioned the mistake again. Robert stayed in Bumpy's organization for 13 years. He became one of the most reliable people Bumpy ever worked with. He told this story many times, always concluding the same way. He could have ended my career that day. Instead, he changed my life. And the only reason he did it that way, I believe, was because of his mother, because of what she had taught him, because of what he was carrying in that first year after she was gone. There is one more piece of this story. It involves a conversation that took place 3 days after Margaret's funeral, in the same small apartment on 118th Street, which Bumpy kept for years afterward, paying the rent until the building was demolished in 1961. He had gone back. Dorothy arrived without being told to come, because she understood. In the way she had always understood the things about him, he never explained directly that this was a moment when presence mattered more than purpose. She sat down across from him. Neither spoke for several minutes. Then Bumpy said, "She asked me something near the end. One of the last times she was really awake and clear. She asked me if I was happy." Dorothy waited. I didn't know how to answer her. Not because I was afraid of the answer, because I realized I hadn't thought about it, not in those terms, for so long that the question felt like it was in a language I used to speak and had mostly forgotten. He was quiet. I told her yes. I told her I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing. And she looked at me for a long time and she said, "Ellsworth, I asked if you were happy, not if you were right." Dorothy said nothing. "She was right," Bumpy said. "She was almost always right." He looked at his hands, then looked up. "I'm going to try to answer that question better. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I'm going to try." Dr. Calvin Reed, who had been present that November morning, left a private account discovered decades later among his papers. In it, he wrote, "I have watched people die for 30 years. I have watched many different kinds of people receive the news of a death, or witness one, or be present when one occurs. I have seen grief in every form, but I have never witnessed anything quite like what I witnessed in that apartment in November 1952. He was, in those minutes, nothing but a son who had lost his mother. Not the most feared man in Harlem. Not the operator who had outmaneuvered the FBI and the Italian families and the corrupt political structure of the city for 2 decades. Just a son. Just a man who had been held in a specific way by a specific person for his entire life, and who was now being asked to continue without that holding. It was the most human thing I ever saw. 3 people were present when Bumpy Johnson cried: Dr. Calvin, Reed, Dorothy, and the cold November air outside a window on 118th Street, which absorbed nothing and revealed nothing and kept, as the city always keeps, its own indifferent counsel. None of them ever told anyone what they had seen. Not during his lifetime. Not for many years afterward. Some things belong to the person who lived them. Some things are kept not because of obligation or fear, but because of the understanding that there are moments in a human life that deserve the protection of the silence of the people who witnessed them. What the city knew was that in the weeks following November 1952, something in Harlem shifted, that the man who had always been a legend became, in some indefinable way, more of himself. that the care he had always shown deepened into something the people around him experienced less as the strategic investment of a brilliant operator, and more as the simple, unmediated attention of a man who had decided that the only thing worth doing with whatever time remained was to be fully present for the people and the place that had made him. Margaret Johnson had taught Ellsworth two things: never forget where you come from, never let anyone disrespect your family. She had also taught him a third thing, the thing underneath the other two. She had taught him, by the example of her own life, that the most powerful thing a person can do is to remain entirely themselves, in every room, under every pressure, regardless of what the world is doing or what the world is asking. That the foundation, the real one, is not territory or money or the architecture of leverage and loyalty that Bumpy had built in Harlem. The real foundation is the thing you carry inside yourself, the thing that stays constant when everything external shifts, the thing that, on a Thursday morning in November, in a small apartment while a jazz record plays, you can press your face into your hands and acknowledge completely, without performance, with the entirety of your actual human weight. Only 3 people saw it. They kept it. But the truth of what they saw lived in every decision he made from that day forward. In every young man he corrected with a question instead of a verdict. In the jazz records he kept for the rest of his life and sometimes played in his office when he thought no one was listening. Some losses make you smaller. Some losses make you more. The difference, most often, is the size of what was lost, and whether what was lost was truly gone or only changed form. Moved from the visible to the carried, from the present to the permanent, from the person who called you by your real name to the name itself, which stays. Ellsworth, it stays. There is a question that people who study power ask about men like Bumpy Johnson, though they rarely ask it directly because the direct form of it seems too simple, too personal, too far outside the frameworks they have developed for analyzing the mechanics of organized crime and political influence and the structural conditions that produce men who operate at the intersection of all three. The question is this: what did he love? Not what did he control, not what did he accumulate, not what strategic advantage did he leverage in any given moment. What did he actually love, in the simple, foundational sense of the word that existed before all the other meanings accumulated around it? The answer, for Bumpy Johnson, was always the same. He loved Harlem. He loved the jazz that came up through the floors of buildings late at night. He loved the specific way the light fell on 125th Street in the early morning before the neighborhood was fully awake, when the street belonged to the people who were finishing their night shifts and the pigeons and the occasional figure moving through the pre-dawn with the purpose of someone who had somewhere they needed to be. He loved the stories people told in barber shops and on stoops, the way the community narrated itself to itself, the way history got made and remade in the telling. He loved chess, which he played regularly and at a level that surprised people who expected a numbers runner to play like a numbers runner. He loved books, which he read constantly and which lined the walls of his office in a way that made certain visitors uncomfortable, as though reading was evidence of something that complicated the story they had decided to tell about him. And he loved his mother, simply, completely, in the way that people loved the person who made them, who saw them first, who carried the original version of them before the world began its work of revising. The specific form that this love took, in practical terms, was the Thursday evenings, 20 years of Thursday evenings. He had begun them when he was in his late 20s, when he had established enough stability in his operations that he could guarantee himself one reliable evening per week that belonged entirely to something other than business. He could have spent those evenings many ways. he chose to spend them with his mother. He never explained this decision to anyone who asked, because no explanation seemed adequate to what the evenings actually were, which was the most reliable point of stillness in a life that was otherwise almost entirely motion. Margaret Johnson never made a point of the Thursdays. She never mentioned them to other people, never indicated to anyone that she had a standing arrangement with her son, never used them as evidence of anything about him or about their relationship. She simply had food ready when he arrived, and records playing, and the particular quality of attention that she had always given him, the attention of a woman who was genuinely interested in the person her son had become, whatever form that person took in any given week. What they talked about on those Thursdays was almost never what most people would have expected them to talk about. Not the operations, or the politics, or the specific problems that occupied most of Bumpy's professional attention. Margaret wasn't interested in those things, not because she was naive about them, but because she understood, better than most people who knew her son, that those things were not what needed tending. What needed tending was the part of him that existed before and beneath all of that, the Ellsworth part. And the way you tended that was not by discussing the empire, but by asking about the book he was reading and the chess game he had played that week, and whether he had noticed that the light on 125th Street in early morning was different in October than in any other month, softer somehow, more forgiving. She had noticed things like that her whole life. It was the observational precision that her son had inherited from her, though he applied it differently, applied it to the strategic landscape rather than to the quality of October light. But the underlying capacity was hers, transmitted to him across the particular intimacy of a childhood spent watching the world carefully, because watching carefully was the only form of power available. In the last months, when the conversations were shorter and the energy required for sustained talking was more than she reliably had, they had developed a different rhythm. He would read to her from the newspaper, choosing stories he thought would interest her, editorials and features rather than hard news, and she would listen with her eyes closed, sometimes commenting, sometimes just listening, sometimes falling asleep in the middle of a sentence and waking a few minutes later to ask him to continue from where he had stopped. He always knew where he had stopped. He had memorized, without intending to, the specific sounds of her sleep, the rhythm of her breathing when she was resting versus when she was genuinely unconscious, the small sounds she made when she was dreaming, the particular stillness that came just before she surfaced back to waking. He had learned these things the way you learn the features of a landscape you have lived in for a long time, not by studying them, but simply by being present for them consistently until they became part of the interior map. This was the map that went silent on a Thursday morning in November 1952 at 11:43, and the silence of it was what finally, after so many years of carrying so much without visible weight, brought Bumpy Johnson to his face and his hands and the long, private weeping that 3 people witnessed and kept. What none of the histories adequately capture is the specific texture of grief when it comes to someone like Bumpy Johnson. Grief for most people is an interruption, a period of disruption that eventually resolves back into the pattern of ordinary life. For Bumpy Johnson, the loss of his mother was something more structural than that. It was the loss of the only relationship in his adult life that had operated entirely outside the logic of his power. Every other relationship, even the closest ones, even Dorothy, even the men he trusted most completely, existed within a context that his position defined. The power was always there, was always a factor, shaped the relationship whether he wanted it to or not. With Margaret, the power had never been a factor. She had known him before the power had formed her relationship with him in its absence, and had continued, with the absolute consistency that defined everything she did, to relate to him as she had always related to him, as the boy whose small fists had clenched on a Charleston sidewalk, as the son who had come to Harlem with $47 and the specific combination of intelligence and hunger and grief prevention that would eventually produce everything he built. The loss of that relationship was the loss of the only mirror that had always shown him accurately. Every other mirror in his life showed him something shaped by the observer's relationship to his power. Margaret's mirror showed him what he actually was, and when the mirror went dark, he was, for the first time in perhaps decades, entirely dependent on his own knowledge of himself. The weeping was, among other things, the acknowledgement of that dependency, the recognition that the external verification of who he was, the voice that had always called him Ellsworth, was gone, and that what remained was the thing she had built, which would either be enough or would not be, and that this was the most consequential test he had ever faced, more consequential than any confrontation with any mob boss or federal investigator or political operative, because this test had no strategic solution, no clever arrangement, no evidence carefully assembled to produce a specific outcome. This test just was what it was. He passed it, not because he was exceptional, though he was, because Margaret Johnson had been exceptional, and exceptional builders produce structures that outlast them. What she had built in her son was not dependent on her continued presence. It was real, it held, it would hold. The jazz records played. Harlem moved through its November morning. 3 people kept a secret, and Ellsworth Johnson, who was also Bumpy Johnson, who was also the most feared and respected figure in the history of American organized crime north of Central Park, sat in a chair beside an empty hospital bed and learned, in the most complete and irreversible way possible, that he was going to be all right. Not because he was powerful, because he had been loved correctly, because a woman in Charleston had cleaned houses and run numbers and sat by candlelight when she thought no one was watching and had taught her son, through the patient accumulation of ordinary Thursdays, everything that actually mattered. Some debts cannot be paid. They can only be honored. The way Bumpy Johnson honored his is the rest of the story that continued in every room he entered after November 1952, in every decision made with a question instead of a verdict, in every Thursday he had already given and could never give again, in the jazz records playing softly in an office on 125th Street when the door was closed and the city was loud outside and the man inside was, for a moment, entirely himself. 3 people saw Bumpy Johnson cry. They kept it, as they were supposed to keep it, in the silence of witnesses who understood that some things are not theirs to give away. But the truth of what they saw lived in everything that followed. Ellsworth, it stays.